There is a difference when you're selling to consumers, also known as B2C, and when you're selling to businesses, also known as B2B. And that difference lies in the decision making. In a consumer space, you're often selling straight to the decision maker, the consumer. Whereas in a business space, as bigger the value of the deal grows, more and more people are involved in that decision process. What I'm gonna outline is how that decision process works, because for many businesses, the decision makers are different. Sometimes it may be a director, sometimes it may be a C-level, sometimes it's an individual user. So what is that decision process? What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna create a new layer. And that layer is gonna go as follows. Now, I'm gonna use an Y-axis down here, and the first part that I'm going to look at is the deal initiation. Somebody initiates the deal, the initiator. That may come from an event, they attended an event, a trade show, or they listen to a webinar, but they do that. And then what happens is they take that in order to the champion. Now the role of the champion is that champion receives the message from the initiator saying like, hey, I just went at an event and saw this. We should take a look at that. The champion starts to understand and say like, you know what? We need to take that to Johnny because this really applies to the person that we really want to involve on this. This really applies to, for example, to our product management team. And the head of product management is the decider. As that decider then comes to the conclusion that they really would love to do that, they take this up to the buyer. And the buyer in this particular role then makes the decision, yes, no, based on what the decider says. The buyer says, we have budget for this, please go buy this. The decider says that to the buyer. Go, please buy this, buy. Now, this is a simple decision process, and often this is something like this in VSB, very small businesses and small businesses, these roles. I can now map these roles. For example, I can say, you know what, in this particular case, the initiator and the champion was the same person. It was person X who went to an event, and they took that in this case, for example, to the VP of product, right? And then he or she told the buyer in order to go and buy that based on the service that they said. Now, what you're gonna find is that the decider is not just gonna make a decision based on the champion. In today's world, we often see that the decider may involve and pull what we call the user. There will be a relationship between the user and the champion. They may check into it with each other. The user, in case, for example, if we are selling an applicant tracking system, they may ask a few of the individual recruiters, have you heard of this applicant tracking system? Have you heard of this particular solution? That is the user, eventually the end user of that product who's being pulled. And so in this role, we see a new role. Is the user, actually having a positive sentiment, particularly about that product? Now, this is a simple decision process, but what we see is there are new roles and additional roles that we commonly see as the organization gets bigger and bigger. The bigger the organization, for example, we see that as this decider wants to make a decision, there's essentially somebody who's going to create a roadblock. This is the roadblocker. And a roadblocker may say like, I'm not really into this. This roadblocker is also known as the gatekeeper. They block this particular purchase. They go like, no. And so the decider knows that if they're going to come up, that the head of product saying like, hey, did we talk to the head of QA? Did we talk to the CEO? Whoever that gatekeeper is, and like, are we aware of that? So for example, in many cases, that gatekeeper, that roadblocker may be the CFO. Now what the decider knows is, if the CFO becoming the gatekeeper, the CFO is really responsive to an analyst. And so now what the gatekeeper, what the decider knows how to do that, they're going to insert a new role in here, and we're going to call that the influencer. Now the influencer's role is in order to eliminate the gatekeeper and the roadblocker, to eliminate the gatekeeper from blocking the road. And the way they do that is the decider says, hey, can you run an ROI model? Can you run the analysis on that? And the influencer now tells the CFO in this case, look, positive ROI, and with that, the roadblock is eliminated by the gatekeeper, and the purchase goes through. What we see is that this is mapping of what they call a buying center to different roles. And although a decision process per company may be different because they may use different titles. It may not be the CFO, it may be the director of finance. This process, the roles that I depict down here, in generally follow this specific roadmap. Obviously not all of them, there's always exceptions, but in 60 to 70% of the case, there's an initiator who takes it to a champion who discusses this. Is this of interest to the company? The champion then says, yes, let's take it to the decider. Either one of them polls quickly with the user. Have you heard of them? Have you seen this before? Have you worked with them? This is kind of like the ear to the ground. Before the decider then makes the decision to go with the buyer, they know who the gatekeepers are in the company, often the person who owns the budget or a person in a parallel organization who has a similar say over it, and they use the influencer in order to help with that. What you got to understand is this gatekeeper is what many of you are struggling with. Many sellers run into that gatekeeper. What you ask, the way how you tackle that, is you talk to the decider and say like, may I ask, have you bought a similar solution like this before? And when that person who is the decider says, yes, we have similar, we bought previously a CRM, a marketing automation system, an ERP system, then you ask, have you run into internal gatekeeper or a roadblocker who didn't want to let the purchase through? And if the person says yes, then you ask, may I ask, how do you normally resolve that? Oh, normally resolve that because we get an ROI. Okay, since you do an ROI, who in your company has normally provided that ROI to the roadblocker, to the gatekeeper? Oh, that normally comes from an analyst. Is it okay if I work with the analyst to create an ROI for the gatekeeper in order to avoid the roadblock? And the decider should say, absolutely, here's the person, work with him or her in order to get the ROI pulled together. This is a way on how you learn how to understand that the influencer's role primarily is to help you deblock the roadblocker. The role of the champion is to make sure that you are aligned with the right project and internal project inside the company, the right decider. Yes, some of these roles overlap. Sometimes you may have multiple decision makers, or you may have one person who's both the champion and the decider. That is true. You still need to address the specific functionalities of each of these blocks, and that is called the decision process.